Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the 2015 MacBook Air and see if this particular MacBook is still worth buying in 2024. Now, the thing I would definitely tell you about these particular MacBooks is that there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Now, the outside of these MacBooks still look sharp. Obviously, they look a little bit dated, but they're very good Macs, and I still think they're very, very good, decent devices when it comes down to it. The only thing is that these are the Intel-based MacBooks, so because of that, you are going to be getting a little bit of a different experience when it comes down to these ones compared to the more recent M series of MacBooks. So that's a very, very big thing to keep in mind. I just want to get that out of the way in the beginning of the video because that is a very, very big thing that could change your opinion about these particular MacBooks. Now, if you do want to pick up some of those newer M series of MacBooks that are better than the Intel ones, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there, and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the 2015 MacBook Air, this particular MacBook was one of the last MacBook Airs they made until they eventually brought it back again a little bit later, I think in 2017 or 2018. So the very top of this particular MacBook, you're essentially getting this very similar type of design that you get from a lot of other Macs, you probably would tell. This was the last MacBook Air with the glowing Apple logo, and there were actually two different models of this. There was an 11-inch model that a lot of people don't know about, and the way more popular 13-inch model. So the very top looked very good. Didn't really have too much to complain about here for the most part. It's the silver model, which looks very sharp in a lot of different ways. Going on the sides of this particular MacBook though, you can kind of see what you're getting here in terms of a port selection and pretty much everything else. Now this is a tapered MacBook, so it starts off at a thicker point, then it tapers down into a thinner point at the very edge. I do think, I appreciate that thinness that, gets from thick point to a thin point. I really like that a lot, but the ports is the really big thing here because for a lot of generation, this MacBook actually had very good port selections, and then when they made the next MacBook Air, they removed all those ports for the most part. So this particular MacBook had two USB 3 ports, which I think was very cool. You had a Thunderbolt 2 port, which essentially was a charging port, a dedicated charging port, which allowed you to grab that MagSafe charger, plug it into this thing, and you can pretty much use this thing from that perspective, which is very nice. And on top of that, you were getting that micro SD card slot and that headphone jack. Now having that standard SD card, I meant to say standard SD card, not that micro SD card, but having that standard SD card slot inside of this MacBook was a very, very big deal. Because you essentially could go ahead and grab your particular SD card from your camera, plug it into your particular MacBook, and you can plug this thing to a charger and then have two USB ports as well. Those are some really nice things to have inside of this MacBook because it didn't have to require you to buy a dongle or do anything else crazy with your Mac. You could just literally plug this thing as you go and use it like that, which I generally think was a very, very good choice. And I do think that, again, is one of my favorite things going on for this particular MacBook. So from a port selection, I will tell you very, very good stuff. And that has aged this MacBook very, very well for my particular opinion. Now on the bottom side, you just had your standard, flat, side to it at the bottom. Not really too much to complain about here either. And that was it. I will tell you from the I/O selection, from the top, from the build quality of this MacBook, it still feels very good. It still feels very expensive. And this is really one of my most favorite things. When I'm getting a MacBook like this, I love having it where it just feels super good and there's not really that much to complain about here from that particular perspective. But I will tell you, when you flip this thing open, this is where things start getting a little bit different. So I will start with the bottom half. The bottom half of this MacBook is probably better than the top half of this MacBook, to be honest. So the bottom half, you were getting that standard keyboard. This was a full-size keyboard, and it did not use that butterfly mechanism that essentially Apple was trying to get all the MacBooks to. This MacBook keyboard has way more travel, and it definitely is a much better, seamless, more keyboard, I would say, with just being more similar to the average keyboard out there at the time and even now, rather than their 2017 onward up until the 2020 MacBook Airs. So there are so many years of MacBooks that I probably wouldn't even recommend the average person to buy just because you were basically missing out on those keyboards that would fail all the time. There's a higher likelihood that a 2015 MacBook Air keyboard is probably still going to be working, where the 2017 onward up until the 2020 MacBook Air's keyboards are no longer going to be functional. There was a big lawsuit, there's lots of things that were happening at the time, but I will tell you in a lot of different ways, Apple kind of did some weird stuff and those keyboards were not great. These keyboards on the 2015 MacBook Air were almost perfect. You're also getting that trackpad at the very bottom too, which is very nice to have. It allows you to maneuver around your whole entire Mac. The top half of this MacBook is a little bit of a different story, and this is where things get a little bit more problematic for the most part. With the 2015 MacBook Air, the issue that you're kind of getting with this particular device is that for the most part, this particular MacBook is not necessarily giving you the best display you can buy on a MacBook Air. For this particular one, you're getting a standard, it's not a great display. It's very pixelated. It's 900 or like 1440p by 900, but it's not what you think. It is a very, very, I guess, pixelated type of display. And when you're looking at an OLED display on an iPhone, or you're looking at the Retina displays on the current MacBook Airs, or you're looking at the IPS panel on the current iPads, those are substantially better displays than this one. Even the iPad 9th generation has a way better display than this particular MacBook. And I would hate to recommend a display to people if it's already going to be outdated, and that is essentially what's going on with this particular Mac. It's a very, very pixelated display, does not really look that great, and that is kind of the big problem that you're getting when you're getting this type of MacBook. So this in and of itself is probably one of the biggest issues that I run into when I get this Mac. You're still getting a pretty good camera on this thing. It's definitely not that great 720p, but it gets the job done. And I will tell you from a lot of different ways, when I'm getting some sort of Mac, and this thing with its display and everything just really isn't that great. And that is kind of the biggest, I guess, problem that you're going to be getting within this particular device. So keep that in mind. Not the biggest deal in the world, but it can be a really big deal to you if you're having to use this display, especially if you're having another Mac or like another iPhone or an iPad that has a significantly better display than this thing. This can kind of be like an eyesore when it comes down to it. From the performance side, and this is another interesting thing going on here. So these MacBook Airs came out in different types of performance levels, but MacBook Airs significantly have always been like not as great of a performing, Mac compared to the MacBook Pros and all these other MacBooks and Mac Minis and iMacs that Apple is basically making. The problem I will tell you with the MacBook Air, especially this one, is that you are using these very outdated Intel types of chipsets. So that can kind of be an issue if you're getting this type of MacBook. On top of that, the top maximum, RAM model that you can basically get is that 8GB of RAM option. And that, again, in and of itself can be kind of a big turnoff for some people because it's really not that, big amount of RAM. Why would you go ahead and buy this type of device when you can go and buy something like an M1 MacBook Air that maybe costs like $600 or $700 in the used market, but it's going to be giving you such a significantly better experience in almost every single way. Because of that, I would just recommend buying the MacBook Air over this thing every single day, like the M series of MacBooks over this thing. Even a cracked display, M1 MacBook Air for like $400 or $500 is better than a brand new 2015 Intel MacBook Air, if I'm being honest. But if you really need to make this thing work, you can probably make it work for a lot of people, but the performance just really isn't that great. And that is kind of the issue that you're getting when you're coming and, kind of messing around with this particular MacBook. So what I can kind of tell you and just kind of sum up this whole entire video, I do think in a lot of ways, this particular MacBook was pretty important. And I do think for several years, it was a very, very important MacBook when it came down to it. The only issue, there's a couple issues here if I'm being honest. So for one, it's an Intel-based Mac. This thing's not supported with software anymore, which is probably the biggest problem. But on top of that, even if it was, the performance isn't really that great with these Intel MacBooks, and you're just running into so many problems there. The display on this MacBook is very pixelated, very low resolution, and it is probably one of the worst panels they have on any MacBook since this MacBook has came out. So that's a really big thing to keep in mind. All of the current MacBook Airs have Retina displays, and they've really refined their MacBook Air lineup, making it a much better deal in a lot of different ways as well. So personally for me, I would not recommend touching this MacBook Air if I'm being completely honest. But I will tell you, there's a lot of other options you can always buy. You can always buy the, the M1 MacBook Airs. You can buy the, M1 MacBook Pro as well. That's another option. This one, it just doesn't really make any sense to buy. And that's kind of how I would leave it at that. So that pretty much covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.